Good evening and welcome once again to Republican Update, brought to you by the Rockland County Republican Committee. My name is Vincent Reda. I'm the chairman of the Rockland County Republican Committee and your host of this show. Tonight, once again, we are pleased and privileged to have with us Frank Sparaco, the newly re-elected legislator and re-elected minority leader of the Rockland County Legislature. Frank, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks so much for having me.
Nice to have you here, Frank. Why don't we spend a moment right at the top of the show to talk about your hard-fought campaign. It got a little bit down and dirty this year.
Yes, it did.
But you were able to survive it very nicely. Want to spend a little time and talk about the campaign?
Absolutely. Thank you. The campaign went very well. It was a hard-fought campaign. I was in two primaries for the Independence Party and the Working Families Party. We did a write-in campaign. I was fortunate enough to win both of those. The Working Families write-in was extremely close. It was I won by 3 votes, so by the skin of my teeth. That was interesting. The campaign and I just basically concentrated on a lot of door-to-door, a lot of meeting the constituents, finding out what their concerns are, explaining to them what my voting record was, what I've stood for in my first 4 years, whether or not they thought I was going in the right direction. Because to tell you the truth, sometimes I took some pretty politically incorrect stances. And I was very interested in running again to know whether or not people would say to me, oh, you can't take that stance. You can't try to cut the Human Rights Department, you'll never get reelected. But I did it anyway because I thought that it was the right thing to do, and I was very curious to see how my constituents would react. During my first 4 years, I went to every civic association meeting, and I tried to keep my constituents involved and up to date as to what I was doing and to get a feel for what they wanted. Because I've always felt that as a representative branch of government, it's my job to represent the view of my constituents. So, we spent a lot of time going door to door and just talking with people. And their number one concern, which is no surprise, was taxes. Taxes, taxes, taxes. Every door I rang on, whether they were far to the left or far to the right, they were concerned about their property taxes and the fact that they could no longer afford to live in Rockland, and the burden that local government and government in general is pushing onto the taxpayer. So I explained to them that what my record was, that I stood for fiscal responsibility, that I'd never voted for a tax increase, that I fought excessive spending, that I proposed millions of dollars in cuts, sometimes to no avail, but they seemed to be very receptive to the idea that, well, at least I was trying. At least they had a voice. At least somebody was out there saying what they would say if they were sitting on the legislature. And I've always tried to do that. Just, if this went to when I vote on an issue, if this went to a public referendum within my district, how would it vote? How would the vote come out? And that's the way, that dictates a lot of times how I vote. Whether or not, some of them are just common sense. A 10% property tax hike my first year in office. Obviously nobody in my district, or most people in my district, didn't want that, so that was an easy one. But sometimes there are some difficult decisions where I could go either way, or I'm just not too familiar with the subject, and it's priceless to be able to have a relationship and to be able to communicate with your constituents, which I try to do through my email list, through mailings, personal phone calls, robocalls. Right. I mean, my palm card had my personal cell phone number. Right. It wasn't a campaign headquarters. You called my palm card if you had a problem, you called me directly. And a lot of people were surprised. They didn't expect me to answer the phone.
Well, one thing comes to mind, matter of fact, a few things that I could think of over the past 4 years. You certainly did make quite a dent in being a freshman legislator, if you will. I know some of the suggestions that you had made, some of them did come to pass. Some were picked up by some other Republicans, and some were even picked up by some of the Democrats. When you mentioned the Human Rights Department, I know you also mentioned the Department of Tourism, which is now basically combined or no more, or
yes,
whatever's happening. Why don't you spend a moment on that?
Well, in my first year in office, I proposed approximately $5 million in cuts that included certain cuts to the Youth Bureau, the Prenatal Care Unit, the Tourism Department, which I've caught a lot of heat for. I've publicly come out and said that giving that department $500,000 a year is ridiculous when you could have a college intern do that job for free. But at the time when I proposed these cuts, or cuts to the Human Rights Department, which still sounds so politically incorrect, but the truth of the matter is it's triplicated services. The Human Rights Department does an investigation. If they find that there was a violation, it then goes to the county attorneys who do an investigation again, and then they hand it over to the state Human Rights Department, who has to reinvestigate everything. Why should you give $700,000 to the Human Rights Department? It just, in these, when we're faced with an $80 million deficit, and at the time it was probably a $25, $30 million deficit 4 years ago, I just didn't see throwing this type of money away when, if somebody has a complaint, they could go directly to the state. It's not like they'd be without. As far as the tourism, it struck me funny that the numbers were always seemed to be, what's the term for that, juiced up. The numbers were fake. They'd say they brought in millions of tourists, but yet they were counting people that went to Rockland Lake, or they were counting people that went to the Palisades Mall as tourists. They called them day visitors. So, in their minds, they were bringing in all this revenue through sales tax. My argument was always, even if you didn't have a tourism
What's
department.
happened with that department since now? They have cut back, correct?
Yes. In this year's budget, the county exec, what I was getting to was, at the time I proposed a lot of these cuts, I was scoffed. People just found it unimaginable. And in this year's budget, the county exec actually proposed all of those cuts that I had just mentioned. And Ed Day and myself, we worked together on, Ed came up with a great idea, like kind of a moderate, instead of cutting the tourism department completely, rolling it into the Rockland Economic Development Corporation and letting them take over. So a lot of those cuts didn't come to fruition because they were in the county exec's budget, but the legislature amended the budget and reinstituted funding for most of those. But the tourism department has been rolled into another department, and has been pretty much, funding's been cut to that department. And the director was moved to the finance department. So
Are doing tourism from the finance?
I don't
department?
think she's doing tourism from the finance department.
Okay. Well, so actually, but these were some of your ideas early on as a legislator. So I could see that some of your ideas are coming to pass. Tell us a little bit about your attempt to try to get a majority. I know you worked very hard on that. You worked with all the candidates. You kind of reminded me an awful lot of one of our heroes. I know one of your heroes, Tom Morahan, when he was in the legislature, he did the same thing very much as you did by getting out and working with each and every person that was running for the legislature.
He pulled it off.
Yeah, he did.
The difference is he pulled it off.
He did, but you came close. You came close.
Absolutely correct. I took what Senator Morahan did when he was a county legislator and took a page right out of his playbook. I tried to establish relationships with candidates, tried to establish relationship with third-party lines to endorse the candidates that would support us in a leadership position, that would support our way of thinking and more of a Republican point of view in control of the legislature, to point the county in the right fiscal direction. So we had numerous candidates. Some of them didn't work out. Some of them did, but we gave them our all. We ran some really great campaigns, and the crazy part about that election, which kept me up at night, is when the election was over, we had some phenomenal candidates. York Kleinhandler, for example, who ran for legislator against Harriet Cornell. He won 2 primaries in the Independents and Working Families Party, and then wasn't successful in the general election.
It was a very, very tough district. It was outnumbered about 6-1, 7-1.
They are tough districts. They're all tough districts. But the crazy part to me was when we were at the Meet the Candidates or debates, the Democratic candidates they didn't lie. They basically said, I don't want to cut anything. I'm not going to be responsible to fire anybody. I'm not going to cut any department. I'm not going to cut services. In these tough economic times, they didn't want to eliminate any programs because their philosophy was people are more needy and government should do more. And I just kept looking at the audience and saying, ladies and gentlemen, if you elect these people, you're looking at a 30% property tax hike minimum. And either people didn't believe me or they didn't care. it was very discouraging because when I go door to door, I spend so much time talking to constituents. It seems like that is their most important issue. And then here you have a whole litany of candidates that basically ran on the platform of, you know, not only am I going to raise taxes, but I'm going to raise your taxes 30%. And they won.
Well, if you recall, at one of our Republican meetings, I had brought up the fact, and this was right after the election, how bad can the people feel? They returned everybody back to office. We didn't lose anything and we didn't gain anything, nor did the Democrats. Whoever they had in there, they sent right back. They're still in a majority, they're still in charge of the legislature. But we did pick up a seat, didn't we?
We did. We were able to win with Chris Carey, who's Legislative District 9, and he replaced Jerry Bierker, who was a registered conservative. So now the minority consists of 6 Republicans. So I guess I could be called the Republican leader instead of the minority leader now, which I know you've made comments about in the past. And you know, so that was great. Chris ran a phenomenal campaign. He's another one, highly outnumbered in his district, but ran a grassroots campaign. His message was right, and he was able to articulate and get his message of conservatism, fiscal responsibility, the Republican principles to his constituents, and thank God they elected him, because I feel he is going to be an unbelievable asset on this board. He's already come in there with just a whole sense of fresh ideas. He comes to all the committee meetings, even though he's not on all of them. Just a sponge, real hungry to learn the process, real hungry to see.
Like a young Frank Sparaco did.
Similar, very, very hungry, and he wants to do right by his constituents, and he wants to do right by the people of Rockland County.
Well, we're going to get Chris on a show at a later date, but he did run an outstanding campaign. He had a great staff put together. His campaign manager, Bob Zeiss, did an outstanding job, and they left no stone unturned.
You could say that again.
They were in a district where they were severely outnumbered, better than 3-1, but yet went on to win that seat, and he did a great job.
It's getting harder and harder to not be outnumbered, even in the redistricting process. Everywhere you look, we're outnumbered. You can't even, it's really getting more and more difficult. Districts that in the mid-90s were strong Republican strongholds, just they don't exist anymore. I mean, there's just a few pockets. Pearl River, for example. It's more and more difficult to find a strong area filled with Republican voters.
Right. Well, of course, the way the lines were cut as well, we tried to get more districts cut that we'd have a better shot, and it just didn't happen. It's just the way it is. So, you know, I'm a firm believer to the victor goes the spoils. So they're still in charge, the Democrat organization, and they cut the lines to suit themselves. Let's spend a minute and talk about the budget, okay? I know you tried very hard to keep the minority together to vote against the budget, and why don't you tell us some of the stories about the budget?
Well, the budget process this year, Vinny, was a complete nightmare, Mr. Chairman. It was beyond what I expected, and I expected a horrific situation, and it was worse than that. The county exec's proposed budget had millions of dollars in cuts, the closing of our county nursing home, and laying off of approximately 600 people. Now, the county nursing home loses approximately $10 to $11 million a year, and it's a major drain on the taxpayers of Rockland County. Now, he also included in there a 2% property tax increase, along with some other revenue enhancements like a cell phone tax, a hotel motel occupancy tax, a lot of these taxes that in my first 4 years in office I spent fighting. But given the current fiscal climate, I felt that it was definitely not a good budget, but it was a budget that tried to at least take a step in the right direction, and in my opinion, the right direction was cuts. Unfortunately, those cuts included layoffs. And the county legislature amended his budget and basically reinstalled all of his cuts, reinstalled funding to the hospital, and did all of that with a 31.5% property tax hike. Not only is there now in this year's budget a 31.5% property tax hike, which, by the way, to me is insanity. I've never, does anything ever go up 31? Did your salary go up 31.5% this year? I mean, it's just 31.5%. And mind you, the year before that, it was 3%. The year before that, it was 5%. And the year before that, it was 10%. I mean, combined, you're looking at almost doubling county property taxes, or a 50% property tax increase in the last 4 years. That's like speaking another language to me. So of course I wasn't going to support that. So this year's budget, as well as the property tax increase, it also includes a hotel motel occupancy tax, a cell phone tax, a mortgage transfer tax, an increase in the mortgage tax, and an increase in our sales tax, to the point where I believe we will be now the second highest sales tax county in the nation.
Had the legislature went along with the county exec's budget, Scott Vanderhoff, and if they would have observed these cuts, there would have been 600 people out of work. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. And I guess the legislators didn't want to be responsible for putting those folks out of work.
Absolutely. It's a difficult decision, believe me. I didn't take it very lightly. I mean, I actually had a meeting. I did a robocall and a mailing to my district, and I said I had to have an emergency meeting, and I explained to them.
I was at the meeting. About 100 and some odd people showed up.
Yeah. Here's the situation. We're going to raise your property taxes a minimum of 30%, or we could keep the hospital that loses $10 million a year so these people could keep their job. And I put it in their hands, and it was almost unanimous. People said, you have to rip the Band-Aid off. If the hospital is losing $10 million a year, as difficult as it may be, you have to close it. And that was just my constituents. That's what I got from my constituents, and it's my
job. Well, there was a proposal by the county exec's office to sell the hospital, wasn't it?
There was a proposal in last year's budget to create a public benefit corporation that would sell the hospital to the public benefit corporation, but that never came to fruition. So it really wasn't on the table this year. We were faced with the situation of either closing it immediately, and you could sell that hospital. I mean, the quotes that I've been giving, and I don't know how correct they are, but the quotes that I've been given is that hospital, the licenses and the property are worth somewhere around the area of $100 million. But my colleagues do not want to lay anybody off. They do not want, you know, if you sold that hospital to a private corporation, they would dismantle the union. So those people would not have their jobs protected the way they are, which I'm not saying is a good thing. That's horrible. Some of these people have dedicated their lives.
Well, maybe there would be a different union in there.
I doubt it. I mean, a private company, the reason we lose, you know, they wouldn't be able to make any money. What they would do is come in and turn it into a profitable situation. But so the bottom line is that this year's budget was proposed by the county executive with massive cuts, and it was changed by the legislature. The Democratic-controlled legislature changed it to basically just foot the deficit on the backs of the taxpayers.
But most of the Republicans voted against it, though.
Yes. Now, what we also had was a 2% property tax cap sent down from Albany that we had to get around. Now, it would take a 12%, a 12-vote supermajority, 12 out of the 17 legislators voting to override the 2% cap. The 2% cap could be overridden. So a lot of the people out there might have a question, how did you override the 2% cap that you thought that was law? It is a law, but there's a loophole in the law that says if the local municipality wants to go above the 2%, all they have to do is vote to go above it. So we needed 6 votes to stop it. Only 2 of us voted against breaking the 2% property tax cap, and 4 of us voted against the budget in general. So as you can see, we are, you know, our philosophical mindset on how we look at governance is much different than the people that are in the majority on the legislature.
All right. Tell us, Frank, what is the current deficit now?
The last number that I believe I was given is not counting this year. It's 80 million as of today. By the end of the year, I think that if some serious steps aren't taken, it probably could go up another 17 to $30 million.
So an educated guess to me would think that there's probably going to be another raise in taxes next year.
I believe that in all honesty, that is unavoidable with the current makeup of the Rockland County Legislature.
Unless some deep, deep cuts are made.
And the Rockland County Legislature, the current leadership of that legislature, has not shown any interest in cutting anything. Not even, you saying deep cuts, that's, $50 million. No interest in cutting $1,000. They do not want to cut government. They feel that our county is undertaxed. They feel that the county portion is below what it should be. They compare us to Westchester, and they want more money to run more government programs, which is obviously our job to try to stop.
Well, you're the minority leader for 2012. Do you have any specific plans that you'd like to see to come to fruition?
As a minority leader, I'd like to just hold the minority together in coming up with fiscally responsible ways to avoid a property tax, excessive property tax increases. I'm not going to support the taxes, just like I didn't support this year's budget. I'm not going to support the hotel motel occupancy tax, the cell phone tax, and the mortgage tax and the transfer tax. So what we need to do as a minority is be the voice of fiscal responsibility. We need to be able to go there and propose the politically incorrect cuts. We need to go there and be able to propose and make those tough decisions that we were elected to make. I wasn't elected to go to the legislature and make friends. We were elected to go there and make difficult decisions. And this isn't the 1990s anymore, where the county was living off sales tax revenue hand over fist, and they didn't raise taxes for 10 years in a row. Some serious decisions need to be made. And right now, we're in the current plan to fix the deficit is to bond the $80 million deficit. So now that's in our state representative hands right now. So Assemblyman Zabrowski and Carlucci have to take that to Albany and get us home rule for permission to bond the $80 million deficit. If they get that passed in Albany,
It's not likely to happen.
which I don't think will happen. And the truth is that there's no option after that. If we don't bond the $80 million deficit and increase sales tax, which is what the Democrats' plan is to basically bond the $80 million deficit, increase sales tax, there's no way the deficit will be over $100 million by the end of the year, which means that out of a $700 million budget, we have a $100 million deficit.
Which makes it very difficult for the people of Rockland. If there's another increase in sales tax, that's why everybody runs across the border, runs into Jersey, buys their clothes, their gas, their cigarettes, and there's, of course, no deposit on bottles and cans there, and we lose a lot of revenue right there. You agree?
I agree, absolutely agree. It's what I call unintended consequences to liberal philosophies.
Okay.
The liberals come up with these ideas that we're going to do this, and we're going to raise sales tax, and we're going to raise property taxes, and it's only this much money. But the unintended consequences to their actions, off subject just for a second, President Obama's idea to double the capital gains tax. There are consequences to doing something like that. It is a devastation to business, to investors. They lose the incentive to go. There are unintended consequences to these liberal policies, and they hurt us all.
Okay, Frank. Explain to our viewing audience what would happen if the state has to come down and take over the budget here in Rockland County. What would the effect have on the county?
I believe that it would be bad for certain towns.
Well, they did it in Nassau County.
Yes.
It worked there.
Did it work out well for
Yeah.
them? I'm not too familiar with
Yeah.
that. But if the state sends down a review board to take over our financial situation, what I think will happen is, first and foremost, they'll cut revenue sharing with the towns, which means that the towns won't get their piece of the sales tax anymore, because by law we're not obligated to do that. I believe they would make some significant cuts to our budget. Anything not mandated would be cut. I believe they would also raise property taxes.
Well, just to back up, in Nassau County it was working, but they also wound up laying off 380 people.
The same thing will happen here.
Yeah.
It'll be a mixture
It
of
was
both.
unavoidable.
Which, if we don't get the $80 million bond and we don't raise sales tax, and if that doesn't work, it is unavoidable in Rockland County.
then
That
again,
review
we're-
board's coming.
But then again, we're going back to a Band-Aid, because next year we're going to have to raise taxes again to meet these obligations. You agree?
I do agree. I do, unless the cuts are made that are necessary. And
So there's no advantage if the state comes down and takes over.
well, if the state comes down and takes over, there is an advantage because it takes control out of the hands of the people that have so horrifically failed us in managing our county finances and puts it into somebody else's
That would be
hands.
the legislature.
That would be the legislature. So the legislature would really have no more control. Anything we did or said would have to be approved by the
By the
review
state,
board.
right.
Our budget, before the county exec gave the budget to us, it would have to be reviewed by the state. So there would be no more over-projecting of revenue to falsely balance the budget. There are some positives to it. I think that the town governments would be the ones most negatively affected because in spite of what you may think about your town government, a lot of people are unhappy in their town or for many reasons. Trust me when I say the grass is much greener in town government. The county could not be any more worse off. So when I look at where I live, for example, Clarkstown, and I see a bipartisan work ethic where they work together to try to bring fiscal responsibility, a 0% property tax hike, a 0.05%. I mean, they've kept the taxes relatively low. They've used their reserve fund. They've worked together in a bipartisan manner to try to accomplish what's good for their constituents. What would happen when the review board comes is that our mess, our dysfunction would roll downhill to the towns. So now the towns would have to fund the narcotics task force. They would have to come up with the funding in Clarkstown for the Clarkstown police that patrols the Palisades Mall. Now, Clarkstown comes up with 70% of the sales tax, and they're going to get 0 of the sales tax if the review board comes in. So it's unfortunate that the town will have to inherit our mess.
Well, there's no question in every town, the police budget is out of control. Out of control. Well, believe it or not, Frank, the half hour's almost up. We got
Wow.
about 2 minutes left. Briefly, could you tell us if you have any plans to try to set the county in the right direction?
Well,
I know it'll take you more than 2 minutes, but wrap it up quick.
Chairman, the bottom line is that we need to start. My plans are to articulate my message to my colleagues in the legislature and try to get through to them that as politically incorrect as it may be to do some cuts, as painful as it may be to lay off some people, as hard as it may be for them to stop frivolously spending money on pork projects or art projects or sculptures and paintings, these decisions have to be made. We must pull together and meet in the middle. Meeting in the middle doesn't mean raising property taxes 30%. We may have to raise property taxes a little and do some cuts also. But my goal is to have us try to meet in the middle and do what's right for the constituents of Rockland and the taxpayers of Rockland.
Okay, Frank, thanks again for being our guest. Once again,
Thank
you're
you,
most
sir.
informative. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'd just like to take a point of personal privilege to give a shout out to the students of Don Bosco Prep High School. And once again, it is the #1 football team in the nation. Over 10,000 high schools participated. Don Bosco, our neighbor in Ramsey, and several people from Rockland County attend that school. Congratulations, gentlemen, to you and the football team. And once again, this is Vincent Reda on behalf of the Rockland County Development Committee. Thank you, Mr. Republican Leader of the Legislature. We'll have you back again in the near future.
Thank
Thank you and good night.